think. And as long as we're doing introductions, our newest member, Melissa Marquez, newest member to the Board of Advisors. Melissa is very notable in this world in that she is the first official current banker. She is the CEO of the Genesee Federal Credit Union in Rochester, who is taking an initiative to build a public bank there in Rochester. So we're delighted to have you with us, Melissa, and the importance that the expertise within banking brings to the Public Banking Institute is great. So wonderful. All right, let me get back to some order here and tell you a little bit about what we're going to do here today. We're going to have a couple of brief presentations, and we'll focus on the brevity so that we can have time to talk together. But the point here is for us to address the general question that I sent out this morning, and that is, does the National Infrastructure Bank Initiative provide a unique opportunity for us all to leverage an impactful national convergence in support of public banking? As you know, the Public Banking Institute started now 11 years ago through the sparking of Ellen Brown's Web of Debt book, has really begun a national movement with the hard work of many people on the screen and many others who have been moving initiatives on around the country. We've had at least over 30 initiatives. We have about 15 of them now actively engaged at the city and state level, municipal and state level. The focus, of course, has been on creating local, regional, and municipal banks. And that's what PBI has been focusing on. And as you all know, the conversation has been, the awareness that our banking system hasn't been working in our interests has fomented a lot of interest, especially as we face the really challenging financial days ahead that are demanded by the infrastructure, but also the status of our current infrastructure, but also the needs of the future infrastructure. So the question is, how might we engineer a powerful thrust through a collaborative initiative in this way? And I would also offer that maybe I think that it's important for us to begin to talk about, to include in our notion of infrastructure, that banking is part of the American infrastructure that is failing and must be changed. And that, for me, is thematic around how public banking across the country gets going. So let me just do a couple of introductions to make sure that you all know both who's here and who has joined us. We have, as I mentioned, Melissa, a new member. We have also added to our board Rowan Gray. Rowan is a professor at Willamette University. He's also the president of the Modern Money Network, a prominent voice in MMT. We're delighted to have him with us, but he's teaching a course right now, and that, of course, is makes for an incompatible thing, but he'll be able to see this video, which of course is being recorded, and we'll expect him on future conversations. I think it's very interesting, by the way, that Rowan said, well, his general view is that a bank, we shouldn't be creating debt to finance infrastructure, as you would expect from an MMT guy, and I think that's totally legitimate. And it's an important part. I would say that theme and that approach is part of the evolutionary process we're in working with the monetary system that we've acquired, inherited, and the one that we've got. So with all due respect to that, I think that needs to be incorporated. I don't see Tom Greco here, but Tom also said early on that he's reluctant to have any centralized financing mechanism for creating for financing public needs, but certainly I think recognizes that that the scale of the infrastructure financing that we need is not likely to be served, as Bob Hockett pointed out in response to him, by local financing arms. But and I'm looking forward to seeing what Alfalfa will say about this. We feel that the local and regional and state level public banking architecture can be important and very valuable in executing these infrastructure investments that we want to be talking about. And it works both ways insofar as having access to a larger pool of capital could invigorate and enable local public banks as well. So it goes both ways. Also a welcome to Tim Canova. Tim, nice to see you. Tim is a professor down in Florida. I trust everything is good for you after Ian. That's great. Yeah, we can't hear you, but go ahead.
I said, thank you, Walt. Everything is fine on my end of Florida. The West Coast, the Gulf Coast is what got hit real hard.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Walt.
So as you look around the screen, you see many people that you already know, and this is going to be an open discussion after a couple of initial remarks. One I'd like to call on is our dear golden goose, Ellen Brown. she is the spawn and the spark here. So Ellen is in Switzerland and recovering from a cold. Poor baby.
Thanks. I'm hanging out with my daughter and 2 grandchildren, and I'm afraid I haven't had much time to actually prepare for this, but I feel it's very important that we align with the National Infrastructure Bank, first of all, because it would be great to have something at the national level that's actually generating money. And we have an infrastructure problem. It's a much better solution to inflation to create more goods and services than to simply raise interest rates, which is going to make it more expensive for small and medium-sized businesses to get going and to produce things. So I think it's an important thing that we have a national infrastructure bank, and it's also important for public banking. I agree with Rowan. It would be great if we could get the Treasury to just issue some $1 trillion coins. That would solve a lot of problems, but it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen now. And we have banks. We have a tradition of the American what's called the American system was basically infrastructure banks. So the first and second US banks were basically infrastructure banks. And then of course the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So it's not like it's unheard of that. And then globally there are national infrastructure banks. So it would be a lot easier to get a big national infrastructure bank going than to try to get the Treasury to just issue the money. So anyway, and of course we know banks create about 95% of the US monetary money supply, and they should be public banks with the public mission. So that's my quick introductory remarks.
Thanks, Ellen. Appreciate it. Let me also take a moment to briefly introduce a couple of a new PBI board member who's with us, Kate McAnulty. Kate is a recent graduate, Harvard graduate in law. Obviously from Harvard, but she's a student of Kristen DeSann. Kristen DeSann is a noted prof at Harvard who is teaching a course in public banking. We're really thrilled to have Kate with us. Certainly a new generation, as I think if you look around the screen, you see a couple of gray hairs. So we're excited to have a new generation on board here. And it's certainly one of our focuses at PBI to get this, to build the demographic profile of PBI, but also generationally as well. Kate is going to be addressing one of PBI's most challenging organizational concerns, which is fundraising. Of course, there's great irony that a banking group would have an issue with having enough money to really operate at the level that we need to. So that irony is self-evident, and I think it's also ironic that that is a concern that's shared by the NIB coalition. Anyway, Kate, would you care to say a couple of words, say hello to our colleagues here?
Sure, it's nice to meet everybody. I'm very excited to be part of PBI. Like Walt said, I got introduced to public banking while I was a law student, and I was taking a bunch of courses taught by Chris DeSann, and also got connected by her to the Massachusetts Public Banking Organization and did some work with them while I was a student as well. So I just totally fell in love with the movement and the mission. And I think to Walt's point, fundraising for the movement is really important. And we do have this unique situation being a banking movement, but I think it speaks to how grassroots the movement is and how community focused we are. So of course we don't have the big bank money that other that other banks have, and so I think that kind of speaks to a strength that PBI has and that public banking has, as well as who our movement is made up of is totally a strength of ours. So yeah, like Walt said, I'm hoping to be of use to PBI, trying to build up some of our fundraising goals and help out in any other way that I can. And
Thank
nice
you,
to meet
Kate.
you all.
Thanks so much for that. Also want to acknowledge Mark Armstrong. Many of you know him already. Mark has been a really dynamic innovator, leader, executor of creating public banks. He was our first ED at Public Banking Institute and has initiated a number of other moves and does consulting in the field. We're looking forward to some things that Mark is going to offer today. I think that we'll cover it for the most part. I certainly would like to acknowledge some deceased members of our board. Unfortunately, we lost Emma Chappelle and Senator Gravel and a couple of others in this past year. It's a shame, but that's life, and we move on. We do what we can with our time. All right. Let me hand things over to, I've made a couple of comments about how we're seeing this as an infrastructure issue, that banking is an infrastructure issue, and that we need to create public banks as we've done in the past. I'd like to set the stage further with Bob Hockett, who has been very active, very present as a featured speaker at National Infrastructure Bank Coalition meetings. He and Ellen both have put this in the context of an American system of finance, of monetary control. So Bob, love to hear from you and set the stage for us here today before we get to Alphega.
Great. Thanks so much, Walt. And thanks everybody for being here. Great to see so many of you again, and great to see some of you newcomers for the first time. So as Walt noted, Ellen and Alphega and I have been sort of tag teaming a bit of late on the matter of a national infrastructure bank. And a lot of the discussions that we've been sort of opening and sort of leading off on have sort of started from the point of view of the current so-called inflationary troubles and the sorts of kill the patient style cures that are being propounded by people like Larry Summers and Larry Summers Jr., also known as Jason Furman, and some of those folk. Rather than sort of leading off in that way this time, since we're talking about a longer term project that we've all been pushing for a much longer period of time than just the past year or so, ever since inflation rates began to appear to be picking up. I'd like to kind of speak from a somewhat longer term perspective in introducing Alphega. And what I'm going to do is sort of channel a little paper I've been presenting at various development economics conferences of late that I sort of whimsically called Dylanomics in honor of Robert Zimmerman, also known as Bob Dylan. And here's the idea. There's a tendency among development economists of the present period to sort of discuss or describe development as if it were a sort of one-off achievement, right? So the idea is that nations begin undeveloped, then they achieve or they enter into a so-called takeoff period, and then they're developed, and then they're done, right? That's it, right? So been there, done that. It's almost as though you were flipping a switch from undeveloped to developed. And from that point on, there's no particular role for the public sector to play, it seems, in the conception of this sort of economic orthodoxy. That orthodoxy might have made a certain sense in the period of the 1960s when it first gained ascendancy. The takeoff notion, after all, originates with Walt Rostow, who was not an economics officer as such, at least not in the sense of being a Treasury official or a Fed official or a member of the Council of Economic Advisors or what have you. He was in the Department of State. In other words, he was helping to pursue American Cold War policy worldwide. And so the understanding of development economics or economic development that Rostow, I think, had in mind and that he was sort of propounding among his fellow orthodox economists was a development economics geared toward essentially enabling former colonies that were now new and developing countries to sort of avoid being tempted, right, by the blandishments of the ascendant and world-conquering Soviet Union. And that might have made sense if you adopted that particular point of view, or if you held those particular values, and if you actually saw the Soviet Union as an evil empire, you know, and distinguished that from the evil empire that was out of the US. But whatever sense it might have made then, it makes absolutely no sense now. Now, the reason I mentioned or channel sort of Bob Dylan in this connection is it seems to me that a better understanding of economic development can be gleaned from a particularly provocative aphorism that appears in one of Dylan's early songs. It's funny, when I think back on this, I used to make fun of my mom, who was a kind of late hippie, for listening to all this kind of stuff when I was a kid, but later I came to it and thought, my God, this is great. But the aphorism I have in mind is the remark or the line to the effect that he not busy being born is busy dying. And I think the same can be said of an economy, or of a political economy, of a society and its attendant economy. That is to say, if an economy and the society around it are not in a continuous state of development, they are effectively in a state of stagnation, right? Now, what do I mean by that, or how would I support a claim like that? Well, it's, in essence, the idea here is that technology doesn't stand still, scientific advances don't stand still, the applications of new scientific, or the potential applications at least, of new scientific discoveries don't tend to stand still. And so what the task is when it comes to development, continuous development of an economy, is essentially to assimilate new technologies and to disseminate new technologies in equitable manners across entire economies. And that includes across all the regions that all go into constituting or making up a particular polity, right, a particular jurisdiction. In the US or Australia or Canada, where you have a virtually continent-sized nation state and hence continent-sized economy that's geographically very diffuse and very spread, you want to ensure, right, that new technologies, new developments are disseminating across all of those regions, again, in a more or less equitable manner. You want, in other words, inclusive growth or inclusive development, but in more than just the sense of incomes being diffused widely, but all of the benefits that come of scientific advance and technological advance disseminating widely. Now, there are a couple of obstacles to that's happening, it seems to me, especially in so-called market economies or mixed economies that include market economic elements like the US economy, that stand in the way and that require concerted public action to sort of overcome, right? So one of the functions that has to be performed, one of the tasks that has to be discharged in order to succeed in disseminating all of the benefits of technology as they are coming online, so to speak, across the entirety of an economy, is some kind of coordinating function, right? You have to be able to coordinate what's happening. For, you know, to use a kind of to sort of appeal to a contemporary example that I think is intuitively tractable and helps make the point clearly, there's very little incentive for electronic vehicle manufacturers to start manufacturing in quantity if there aren't networks of charging stations that are akin to, in their spread, networks of petroleum stations, gas stations, or what have you, right? And similarly, there's not much incentive on the part of those who could create or provide such charging stations to do that if it doesn't look like there's going to be a market for EVs that use those charging stations. And so you're confronted, in a sense, in any large diffuse economy like our own, with a problem that's sort of akin to the old French cartoon from I think the late 19th century, where the two fellows are looking into a doorway, and one says after you, the other one says no after you, no after you, and ultimately they never get through the doorway. Or, you know, to use another example from my own state of Kansas, where I spent a good bit of time, there was a law in the books once that told two trains that were approaching each other on parallel tracks that each was required to stop and wait for the other one to pass before proceeding. It doesn't take much thought to see that that's essentially a recipe for stasis, for stagnation, for no movement. Some kind of coordinating has to be done. Now, I think that the old Soviet Union's Gosplan gets a bad rap and was actually a much more effective thing than people give it credit for. But even if you don't don't buy into that, even if you don't believe that, it doesn't take much to see that some minimal degree of coordinating has to be done as a public function in order to have continuous development of the kind that I just sort of briefly described. So that's one obstacle. Another obstacle is financing, right, for the development of new technologies and for, more crucially, for the scaling up of the production and provision of new technologies. Financing is often very difficult to come by when there's a new project whose success is not assured, that's somewhat speculative. And that's one obstacle, or one reason that financing can be difficult to come by. The other reason, of course, is that private sector financial institutions, particularly in so-called already developed economies like that of the US, are essentially rent extraction schemes, right? That's all that they are, right? First of all, they extract rent in the lending of finance capital, which they artificially keep scarce, specifically in order to be able to derive rents from them. And second of all, insofar as they demand that their investments be profitable, they are accordingly demanding that the investments themselves are investments in rent extraction schemes or other rent extraction opportunities that they can then take part in. And that's precisely why you don't have available financing for all of the best new technologies that show the most promise to transform all of our lives in an equitable manner. That's why you don't have sufficient financing for those, notwithstanding the fact that there is no shortage, no inherent or natural shortage of finance capital, which, as we've talked about multiple times, is generated by public authority in any event and has no immediate limits on its generability other than constraints on the usability of that capital in productive ways rather than speculative ways. Now, that in turn, I think, accounts for an interesting fact of at least American experience when it comes to national development. Now, again, bear in mind, I'm saying this is American experience because if it weren't for the fact that we have these long settled expectations that you can only finance by lending at interest and taking money, that if we didn't have that sort of experience, we wouldn't have to be talking about banks at all. We could simply be talking about public sector authorities disseminating claims on resources, i.e. non-debt-based money, claims on resources that can be used to produce further resources. But because our traditions don't include that, and because it's going to take a lot of work, intellectual and otherwise, to change the nature of the financial system in that particular way, which I tried to show various ways we could do that in various publications. But until we get there, if we're actually going to have to be talking about a banking model, then what we can do is look at, again, a particular formula that seems to have worked very well in American history or American experience when done right, and sort of sets the stage for what Alfecca is going to propose to all of us. So the model essentially combines a kind of planning board or coordination body at the federal level, right, that kind of oversees the entire national economy with a view to coordinating the dissemination of new technologies and new developments across industries, across sectors, and across regions, on the one hand, with some sort of centralized financial institution that makes financing available on nonprofit terms, or at the very least on terms that are only designed to essentially account for any sort of risk that attends the lending, but isn't meant to sort of derive or extract rents on behalf of private sector people. So how does that work, or what are the examples that I have in mind? I'll just really briefly sort of kind of rattle them off and then turn it over to Alfecca. So during the so-called Hamiltonian period of America's sort of first developmental movement or first developmental stirrings, you had on the one hand a Treasury Department that saw it as its mission to oversee the rapid diversification of the American economy as quickly as possible to essentially avert the newly independent United States' reversion to either actual de jure colonial status through some sort of invasion and takeover by the British again, or by the French or the Spanish, or de facto neo-colonial status, basically by leaving the economy distorted or warped in the way that it was from the get-go, because it was created simply to provide natural resources of various kinds over to the metropole in London to essentially then produce industrial products of those materials. So the understanding was that if the nation was to retain its autonomy and independence, It had to have its own diversified economy. And so the Treasury Department was overseeing a kind of diversified development across the entirety of the new country. Meanwhile, the first Bank of the United States that Hamilton also conceived of as sort of part and parcel of this plan was designed to mobilize available capital and to disseminate it in ways to facilitate the financing or to do the financing or to facilitate that particular form of development. That same model was replicated during the Civil War period by the Lincoln administration. We tend to forget this now, it doesn't get a lot of play, but the Quartermaster General's office, essentially a big military office, was essentially the national economic planner in the 1860s. And then we handled the financing through the establishment, as you guys know, of a national banking system. Finally, in the 20th century, we replicated the model 2 more times, with the War Industries Board on the one hand and the War Finance Corporation on the other hand, to facilitate the rapid development of defense-related industries as the First World War was becoming imminent, at least as an American involvement. Then the second time around, during the Great Depression and then the Second World War, we replicated that structure again. A war planning board essentially was a remake of, and indeed a sort of a new improved version of the old War Industries Board of the First World War. And the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was just a revitalized war finance corporation that was now geared toward the civilian economy as well as the military economy, did the financing in that case. It seems to me that we have to do something a bit like that again now, at least insofar as, or for as long as we're stuck with the banking model as the primary mode of public financing. And if we do that, then I think one way to do it would be to essentially enact a particular piece of legislation that I now have before Congress that would replicate this coordination board idea on the one hand, and then that would include a federal public financing arm to complement it, like the old RFC or the WFC or Hamilton's Bank or Lincoln's banking system. On the other hand, one way to do that would be to upgrade the existing federal financing bank and treasury. Another way to do it would be to start a new institution from scratch, precisely of the sort that Alfecca is going to be talking to you about, a national infrastructure bank. And with that, I'll hand it over to Alfecca.
Thanks, Bob. And because I know that Dr. Marois has an absolute hard out at 20 for a critical meeting, I want to give Thomas a chance to put this into an international perspective, and then we'll come to you, okay, Alfecca? Thanks, Bob, and Thomas.
Thanks, Walt. And Alfecca, sorry, I don't mean to jump in and steal your thunder there, because Bob set you up so nicely. And oddly enough, Bob, I was just giving that lecture a few hours ago to my class at SOAS, talking about modernization theory and all that. So great to hear it again. Let me just take a few minutes because unfortunately I do have to pop out for something quite related to what we're talking about. But there's just a couple of things I wanted to mention and I think are important. And I think one thing in terms of the overall movement and this question of the relationship between a national infrastructure bank and local banks and so on, and I make this comment fairly widely in the sort of discussions I have with the US, is that I think there is room, to look beyond your borders. And that's not at all, a poke at you, Bob, at all. It's just that this model is replicated worldwide and has been going on for decades, if not more than a century, in many countries around the world, and works quite effectively. And there are different ways of providing funding and so on between a national institution and more local institutions. And there are both a lot of promising lessons that Americans can take from these long-standing experiences and questions of the sort of pitfalls of these kinds of different interactions and how they work well and haven't worked well. And in that, we can point to a whole range of different examples. And clearly, I think many people in this space, in this room, would be familiar with the German model of a national, very powerful infrastructure bank that then has very clear, sustained, and long-term linkages to regional and local development and retail public banks, cooperative banks, and private banks. And I mention that to jump to a topic that's not often talked about, but it's the question of the credibility of the institution and its long-term capacity to become a legacy institution. And I think this is a really important topic that has to be thrown on the table in terms of a national infrastructure bank and its connection to community. Because one of the things that enables the persistence of an institution like the KfW in Germany over 80 years now, in a sense, not quite 80, but is that it has connections to community, and it's held credible and accountable to its community through its governance board that has representatives, in spaces that are allocated by law onto that governing board of this powerful institution that connects it both to the government, which I know is a terrifying thought in much of the US, the ministers of finance and the environment and energy on that board, but then they also have 35 other members from trade unions, from SMEs, from other types of banks, I can't remember them all offhand, but a good range of members on that board that then connects that institution broadly across society and creates a sense of credibility in that bank. And when you don't have it, you get instances like in the UK when they created a new green infrastructure bank that did well and made money, so they privatized it. Gone. Nobody cares because nobody had a connection to it until we need a green bank because everything is boiling to death. Similarly in Canada, look to your neighbors to the north, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, created quite top down, same kind of idea, though the funding model is awful, very ambitious, but its governing model is terrible. It's just like, let's put like 7 people on the board. We don't know who they're going to be, but let's just pick them randomly. But there's no specification in law. And it's also tied to the question of mandate. Will the bank have a public purpose mandate? Will it be bound to advancing the public interest? Or, again, in the case of this awful Canada Infrastructure Bank, is it mandates specifically to leverage private finance? And that's it. Obviously with huge problems emanating from that in terms of representation and so on. I think these are the kind of questions that if you begin to question, well, how do we create a legacy institution that's credible, that's accountable, that's democratic? How do we create a governance board that then connects it to communities across the country? That then links naturally into then what kind of institutional representation are you going to find on the ground in regions, in states, in cities that can then feed back up and inform that overall sort of powerful and needed and necessary financial institution, as you're very much pointing out. And for me, I think this is really the answer. To the extent you could have the federal government just plowing out money, it still begs the question: are you getting it to the right place, to the right people, at the right time, at the right scale, on the right terms? And is it accountable? And these are the things that can only be done through a set of institutional relationships, and ones that are connected broadly across regions into cities and are connected. And for me, I think fundamentally that really is, that question has to sit alongside any question of, scale. Are we going to have national institution? Fine, but what is this going to be? A governance structure? How do you create a legacy institution that will represent the public interest? How do you connect that to communities? I think we need a lot more. I think, in general, everybody, we just haven't been studying this topic. We don't know enough about it, but it's something, that should be put on side alongside this question of how do we get the money? How do we distribute it? Thank you. Thanks for the time. And great to see everybody here again. It's wonderful to be in the room with you.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Thomas and Bob both created a great stage on which Alphecca can build, describe what the NIB looks like. I think, Thomas, your point about the local, the importance of the local presence as the replication of the national commitment is spot on for the kind of strategic thinking that we want to be doing here at PBI. So thanks once again, Thomas. And I would just point out, by the way, that there are new academic threads and curricula that are developing in our midst. That Thomas is creating one in Canada. We've got Rowan doing one on law in Oregon. Bob has related courses and so forth. So anyway, I will stop and turn this over to Alphecca, who is now no longer with the IMF, was a macro economist there, and is a principal leader in the National Infrastructure Bank. Welcome, Alphecca. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for coming on board for this really important discussion. And the setup, I couldn't have gotten a better setup from these two professors if I had tried. And I'm going to address many of the things that they have raised in terms of coordinating infrastructure investments and how do we govern this institution. So I do have a little bit of a slideshow, and I'm going to actually take Professor Marois, before he gets off, I'm going to take his suggestions, which we do implicitly have built into this bill, but it can always stand improvements. So one of the things that I'm asking Professor Marois is, if you want to take a real practical example for your students of how to extend this, there is a bill in Congress. It's been introduced twice. It's HR 3339 in this session. It'll have to be reintroduced in January. But the sponsor of the bill, Rep. Danny Davis from Chicago, Illinois, has asked us if there are any comments for improvements to the bill when it goes in for the next round of introduction. Then please coordinate them all up to his office. And so I'm asking you, the bill is only 75 pages long. I'm going to go through really quickly how it works. But if you see areas of governance that need to be strengthened exactly along these lines to avoid all the pitfalls of things like the Bank of Canada, to do the same kinds of constructive infrastructure development that was done by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, beautifully complicated projects with lots of regional development that built out economies and was equitable with equitable development that went along with housing and everything else, and wants to keep public infrastructure in public hands. That's a major goal of this bank. We don't think that water and everything else should be privatized, nor housing for that matter either. We need public housing, those kinds of things. We want to make sure that this bank targets and builds them, because our federal budget is not up to the job. The proof of the pudding is our investment in infrastructure has fallen from 5% or so of GDP in the 1960s down to 2.4% today. That just shows you it gets crowded out of budgets. For the most part, fiscal conservatives do not want to pay taxes to fix infrastructure, and that's the reason why we need, in my view, an institution that directs infrastructure investments at certain targeted areas where our nation is screaming that we need help to build out everything from climate change to high-speed rail to affordable housing, those kind of things. So we do have a bill in Congress, and I do really ask you to look at that bill and give me any, but this is the way that this bill is working. So far, we have 17 co-sponsors on this bill. The number of co-sponsors has really accentuated since the bipartisan infrastructure law came out a year ago. And the reason for that is because local legislators realize the bipartisan bill and what's coming from the budget is not going to be large enough to do the whole job. And they are pushing their members of Congress from the bottom up to come on board and sign on to this bill. So that's been a winning proposal. And you can see that in all of the endorsements that we've gotten. The way that what our coalition is working is we're going through legislators putting in resolutions for to endorse the bank, ask their members of Congress to come on and endorse the bank. And we've had quite a bit of success. 25 state legislators have introduced resolutions. 8 of them have passed one or more chambers. And then we've also got a whole host of other organizations. Labor unions recognize this is going to be great for labor. It's going to bring on millions of new great paying jobs. Other organizations have introduced and endorse the NIB legislation as well. So as you said, this is not a new idea. We've had 4 really large banks in our nation's past. It is the Hamiltonian idea. And this particular piece of legislation copies those fundamental institutions that built most of our nation's infrastructure. And what we can see from our own historical example is we need a permanent institution. And the reason is because these all had 20-year sunset clauses with the exception of Lincoln's banking system. That's why they're not around anymore. When they're there, we build infrastructure. When they're not there, we don't, and we kind of fall apart. So the lesson learned there is we need a permanent institution to continually refurbish and reappoint our basic infrastructures that our economy keeps on rolling along. And this is the way this National Infrastructure Bank works. It is the Hamiltonian model. Instead of going to the budget and asking for money to get the bank started, we go to the private sector who are holding treasuries and ask them, would they like to sell in a small portion of them into the NIB in exchange for preferred stock that would make these investors non-voting investors in the bank. So that's important because the say-so of what the projects are that are being financed will come out of the charter of the bank itself. However, the investors get paid a little extra. That's also the Hamiltonian model. And that interest stream would come out of earnings from the loans and plenty of money left over. I have a write-up on the website on how the National Infrastructure Bank creates and makes money and is capitalized using this system, if anybody is interested to look at it. And then, of course, the capital sits on the bank's books, and the NIB gives out a loan exactly like a commercial bank. Each time it books a loan, it creates a deposit. You're creating money, uses cash on hand from other deposits to move money out of this and into the rest of the banking system. That's also in the write-up. So the loan process works exactly like a commercial bank. We can leverage up this existing debt to capitalize our bank and then have a public bank to lend only for infrastructure projects. Borrowers would be state and local governments. Anybody that owns public infrastructure can come in directly for a loan to improve its, could be a housing authority, a water utility, could come in directly. That'll make sure that the loans get into every single corner of the nation to improve our infrastructure. We'll be covering $5 trillion in needs for new money over the next 10 years. That estimation came from the American Society of Civil Engineers. So the good news is we know up front sort of how much we need, and we can size our bank to the scale to complement and finance everything, to repair infrastructure, transportation, water systems, the electric power grid. We added categories of our own that are also critical: a complete high-speed rail network, broadband everywhere, affordable housing, large-scale water projects. The idea here, by mentioning all of this infrastructure in the bill itself, is that we make sure we're directing our infrastructure investments at these very critical systems that are falling apart across our country. Then bipartisan law that passed last year is not going to be enough. This compares what the NIB will provide in financing in billions of dollars, and this is what the bipartisan bill will provide, which is 1/10 too small. So if we're serious about fixing infrastructure, we're going to need the National Infrastructure Bank to top up, provide financing for the other 90% of the financing money that's still not available. We think that the operations of the National Infrastructure Bank will not only fix everything, but will supercharge the American economy. It'll create millions of new great paying jobs. Legislation requires workers be paid Davis-Bacon wages. Buy America only for construction inputs to stimulate American manufacturing. We can get our GDP growth up to around 5% per year. That's where it was when the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was in existence. And we have some nice economic modeling from the University of Maryland to show the same. Get productivity up, trucks will move faster, the whole economy will be much more productive, all with no new federal taxes, spending, or debt. Because the fiscal conservatives don't want to pay taxes to pay for infrastructure, it cannot be done through the budget, but we can do it through this lending bank with no recourse, no net call on the federal budget. Also will reduce inflation, because now we'll be attacking the supply side of the economy, getting things produced faster and with greater, for every dollar that we create and lend for an infrastructure project, plow back $3 to $7 back into the economy, increase supplies, prices will come down. Offset a coming recession if Larry Summers and Jason Furman have their way and tank the economy. That's really going to be bad. We could even have a financial crisis come out of this. The National Infrastructure Bank, there's going to be high unemployment. The National Infrastructure Bank can come in with these infrastructure jobs right away, a whole filing cabinet full of backlog projects that are fairly shovel ready and ready to go, roads, bridges, all those kinds of things. Areas of emphasis: affordable housing. We now from COVID, we're in a very bad situation. A big chunk of our population is housing insecure. Inflation has hit them hard. They can't afford to buy food, pay for their medicine, pay their rent. They're getting evicted. This is an absolute critical crisis we need to take care of. A high-speed rail network across the country would not only move intercity traffic much faster, but would create economic corridors of development. That's what China did. Ellen Brown has a great article on how they've done that. And it just makes phenomenal sense. You can see the before and after pictures on the ground of what a high-speed rail system will do for your economy. Not only will it do that, it'll save on fuel and CO2 emissions and congestion problems. Our electric power grid is teetering on the brink. We've had record high temperatures across the country. Weather events have crushed it all over the place. Even the renewables that have been built in California and New Mexico and other places like that, there's no way to move that renewable energy around. And so this bank will pay for a grid overlay to move renewable energy and all the grid enhancements to make sure it is secure from weather and cyber attacks. Water crisis is extremely troubling. This is where the drought is right now in the Southwest. This is where the groundwater is collapsing because there's not enough water coming down out of the mountains or down the Colorado River, and people are sucking the groundwater dry. The reaction seems to be just to cut off all water going to farmers. Well, that's not going to work because we grow upwards of, in these air states, we grow upwards of 40% of our nation's food supply. And if we do that, we're going to have spiking food prices in the next 5 years. It's already started to happen. Lead service lines, we want to fix them all. We want to help. This bank has a special component in it to make sure that we not only have economic growth, but equitable economic growth, and that all features of this get down into every single region and city council. We use the Jim Clyburn 10-20-30 rule to make sure that chunks of financing and projects get into low-income areas, tribal areas. We want to make sure that we stimulate minority and women-owned businesses, and everybody has a fair access to these great Davis-Bacon wage jobs. So that'll be a big component of the bank as well. And then finally, we think that this large planning bank can, as an institution, can also work very well with state public banks, local banks, even the bond market in the following ways. For example, the NIB will be financing what these other entities have not been able to finance so far, the whole backlog that's built up. It'll provide direct financing for this public infrastructure as an institution. And then local borrowers will have a say-so because they'll be selecting and applying for these projects. On our board of directors, we do have 25 board members, which will be engineers with participation from state and local governments. Disadvantaged groups can come in. We'll be on the board as well. We'll be financing all the gap that these other budgets don't finance, so we're not competing with them. We're actually complementing them. And then other institutions can lend as before. Then coming out of all of this direct investment, there'll be lots of new business opportunities and higher growth rates. And that will build up commercial and industrial loans in the banking system. The great example, of course, that Bob Hockett can speak to is the Great Depression and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, when all the banks were closed and it acted as a lender of last resort. When local banks refused to finance things, the bond market grew, and all of the projects were complicated across state lines, like the Tennessee Valley Authority. Those kinds of things can be built with the latest technologies and with streamlining the loan process and the development process to reduce construction costs. And then operationally, local banks can contribute their know-how. They can act like a storefront for the National Infrastructure Bank. Even their loan officers can act as storefronts, for a fee, and they can also assist in the tracking of the loan after it's given out to make sure it stays on track. Meanwhile, the National Infrastructure Bank can have back office engineering teams, mobilize all these projects, go across state borders, offer a government guarantee for jointly funded projects. It can even act as a correspondent bank for local banks, and it does not compete for capitalization money because it uses this unique Hamiltonian model to capitalize the bank. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions about how the NIB works.
Alfecca, thank you. That is extraordinary. And I see we already have a hand up and the floor is open. I would just want to say, Amara, be right with you, but just I think one of the things that's relevant to today's focus about whether or not the Public Banking Institute as a grassroots, localized, relatively localized efforts should participate. I think that question has just been answered really beautifully, that there is this natural collaborative strength. And what we, I think along this way, I hope that we're talking about how can we empower this collaboration. So go ahead, Amara.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's really extraordinary, and also thank you to Bob for kind of laying the groundwork, and Tom, who I think had to hop. I just had a couple of questions that kind of to the last point about how working in coalition. Well, one issue was the issue of prioritization of projects. And what comes to mind for me is being in Chicago and having a humongous task with regard to our water system, our lead pipes, something the city has essentially made marginal progress on, pretty much no progress. It is of a scale that is really, it's just significant. It's billions of dollars. And it's something that needs to be done. And I'm also thinking about Jackson, Mississippi, as well as Flint, Michigan. And the notion of how projects are prioritized at the federal level, understanding that there's a governance board or a body that exists that would hopefully be representative, but also that doesn't necessarily safeguard from the places where the need perhaps is highest, actually getting access to the resources from the National Infrastructure Bank to address the infrastructure issues at the local level. So that's one issue. And then the second, on the notion of collaboration, it was a question of what does an effective collaboration look like when it comes to those who are pushing for public banks at the local level, because does this legitimize existing banks by saying, yeah, we can, the National Infrastructure Bank can work with local existing banks. They do this relationship that you outlined. But for those of us who've been sort of pushing for public banking at the local level or the state level, how do we make sure that our messaging is clear? Because I also don't want for it to be the case where it's like, okay, well, we have this National Infrastructure Bank, and then, well, they can just work with the local banks and we don't need any public banking at any level besides this, right? So it's just a question around how do we get our messaging clear about what the implications are and how does this impact other advocacy efforts around public banking?
Thanks, Amara. Alfecca?
So let me take the first question about prioritizing projects. One of the ways that this is handled is, first of all, we make sure that the bank is big enough to cover everything. And Chicago's lead water pipes is a great example. We followed very carefully engineers in your city that went around to track down the problem and see how big it was. And concluded that maybe, and they talked to a lot of other water, entities across the country, concluded maybe that city needs $12 billion just by itself, just for lead water pipes. Well, what's in the bipartisan law is only $15 billion for lead pipes for the whole country. So you can see that it's not large enough. So one thing we've done is make the bank large enough. We've got $280 billion in there just for lead pipes, plus another $600 billion for all the rest of the water infrastructure. The treatment plants, the stormwaters that are overflowing and killing people in the Northwest every time they have a big rainstorm, these kinds of things. And then we can fix all of the stuff underneath the roads at this in one bundled project that that's different entities can take the debt on for to lower the whole cost instead of digging up roads multiple times. Doesn't make any sense. So, and what if we have really low income areas like Benton Harbor, Michigan, that is Michigan, right? That can't, that's the latest poster child for lead pipes that can't maybe afford to take on these loans. This National Infrastructure Bank is a public bank. We want to use the same modus operandi that the Reconstruction Finance Corporation used. We want to lend into them anyway. Why? Because we want to train up all of their local workers to do this kind of a construction. That was very much the model of the RFC when it electrified rural America, 90% of which had no electricity. Everybody said, you can't lend to them because they can't pay back the loans. Well, not only did they pay back the loans, but they bought electric appliances on credit, and they built out their farms, milking equipment and things like that. And that's how they grew. And through the economic growth, they were able to pay back the loans. But in the short term, we will be lending to them these low income areas anyway, because what we expect is that the growth will come for sure down the line. But if they can't afford to take a loan, there's also a mechanism in the bank that any excess profits from the operations of the lending operations will go into a trust fund, and then we'll distribute that trust fund as grants rather than loans to very low income areas. So altogether, this is an economic development program. We want to go after pockets of poverty in the United States. We want to lift up all boats at the same time evenly with equitable growth, paying great paying wages, providing affordable housing, getting people hooked up with better mass transit to get them back and forth to work, shorter commuter times. Altogether is a big package deal. So that's on the project selection. We don't have to select projects because we have enough money to cover them all. And then on collaboration with local public banks, we think there's going to be lots of secondary business that's going to come out of this direct investment from the NIB. This will really promote small businesses that may need to come in for loans from local banks, from public banks. We can do joint collaborative projects like building housing. There'll be lots and lots of scope. There's plenty to do here, and there'll be lots of scope for, and those public banks will have presence on the ground, the local banks too. They'll be, as I said, able to act as storefront. There's lots of ways financially that we can collaborate. And we think that this is going to need all hands on deck to reformulate the banking financial sector into something that's really benefiting America's productivity, growth, and health.
Thanks, Alfeka. It's beautiful. I think talking about changing the ecosphere of banking itself is absolutely part of this. And the tie into local banks, we all know BND works that way. That's the model we've been using. We think it's enormously powerful. Thanks. And you guys, please speak what you like. Using the hands is great. Ellen, you've got yours out. And so does Mike. I see Michael's next.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, it sounds like a neoliberal World Bank applied for the United States. My problem with this is it's the opposite of how America developed its infrastructure in the late 19th century. The problem is that if you make a bank loan for infrastructure, you have to recover the cost. And that means that the infrastructure that you finance has to make enough money at least to pay the direct costs and not to mention the interest charge. Now, in the way that America financed its infrastructure in the late 19th century was spelled out by probably the main economist, America's first business school economist, Simon Patton. He said that infrastructure was a fourth factor of production, besides labor, capital, and land. However, unlike these other factors of production, the purpose of infrastructure is not to make a profit, not to mention interest. The purpose is to produce goods and services below the cost of production so that you subsidize the economy as a whole so that you can lower the cost of doing business. And his idea, and this was exactly what America did in the late 19th century, was to finance infrastructure through the budget and provide it either freely or at a subsidized basis. If you look at, for instance, the high-speed rail, just the cost of land acquisition is enormous to get the right-of-way. You are building in such a high price of infrastructure that your price will be about 10 times as high as countries like China or Europe, Germany, that finance infrastructure with public funding, providing it very inexpensive. Imagine that you were funding education, and you would have education actually pay for the cost of universities with all their overhead plus interest, instead of making infrastructure free. You've mentioned public health. Imagine if you were investing in public health. And here's something that other countries produce freely or at a subsidized basis. You would make America an even higher cost public health industry than it is today, except, of course, if you would make loans to pharmaceutical companies that did not seek economic rent, then it's okay. The TVA was okay. That was wonderful. And that was able to recover the expense plus costs. But there are very few examples, and the examples that you've cited are the examples that would have to be priced so highly that you would be pricing these infrastructure services above the market. It's a neoliberal plan. It's against everything that public investment in a mixed economy stands for.
Alpheka, comments?
Well, I take your point about keeping public infrastructure costs low because they have external returns to the whole economy that you can't pick up by the private sector. And privatizing them is obviously a disaster. That's not worked out for water companies in Pennsylvania. It's not worked out for a lot of things with Canada's model. And we need to keep public infrastructure in public hands. Does it make money? Can you recoup your costs? And I absolutely think that if you look at the example of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a development entity like this, whose first objective was to hire people that were all unemployed as a result of the Great Depression, but took on the added responsibility of doing development of the economy. And the TVA is a great example. The rural electrification is a great example. These kinds of projects, even though they don't look on their face like they can make money, they do make money as a result of stimulating economic growth and productivity in the economy as a whole. And then that brings in more tax receipts to local governments to allow them to pay back the loans. That model is forecast with an input-output model, something like the University of Maryland uses. But it also historically was the example. The RFC lent to areas that didn't look on the face like they could be paid back, but in the end, it made money for government and all the loans were paid back.
Oh my God. That's the model that people used for the Olympics in Montreal and other countries. They all were supposed to make money, and they're all an absolute disaster. The model's fake. It's junk Keynesianism. It's not a realistic model. This is really it picks up all of the mistakes and the disasters that the World Bank has done, and it treats America like the World Bank treated Latin America. I think it's a disaster.
I don't know about the usefulness of an Olympic stadium, but I do know about the usefulness of getting broadband into rural areas so that you can use it for telehealth, teleeducation, and those kinds of things in the same way as electricity benefited rural America. I do know about the benefit of roads, transportation, where our economy is at a standstill parking lot. We live on the East Coast, where 5 lanes of new roads have been added to interstates, and they're just parking lots charging tolls. I take your point about construction costs being more expensive here. And that goes not to organic problems, but the Center for Transportation just this month came out with a new report saying, yes, We spend 10 times more on rail as any of the next 10 nations down the road, down the line. And why they identified the reasons for it it's not because of right-of-way. We have plenty of right-of-way, rail right-of-way around the nation that's not being used. It's institutional mobilization and planning and making the kinds of things that Dr. Hockett said his new organization would be helping with to streamline and mobilize. And that's another reason why we need a central sort of kind of planning authority to work on these kind of infrastructure type of projects. But Bob, would you like to comment on how the Reconstruction Finance Corporation did do these development projects?
Yeah, just a quick observation, sort of in that connection. So first is, again, I think ideally we wouldn't rely on a banking model at all, right? Ideally, we would simply use public funding to provide public goods, and we wouldn't expect those public goods to yield profits for private sector actors necessarily. We would just want them to be useful for various purposes, some of them money-making purposes on the part of private sector firms, but many of them just to sort of improve the quality of life in various ways. It seems, however, that pushing something like that right now in the sort of American political context seems to be kind of a non-starter. And we're getting closer and closer to a point where that won't be a non-starter, I think. I suspect even within our lifetimes, we'll reach the point where it's no longer necessary to think in terms of banking when we think in terms of development, or think in terms of borrowing when it comes to development. But until we are there, it's tempting to me as a matter of tactics, essentially to use the sort of trappings of a banking or lending or financing model, but then to make the real terms of the arrangements de facto not profit making and de facto not profit recovering or rent extracting or the like. A couple of ways that seem to me promising for doing that are, first of all, to allow for cross subsidization, in the sense that if some lending actually does yield profits, let those profits compensate for actual losses on the balance sheet with respect to some investments. And then relatedly, when it comes to sort of recovering the costs of lending, take those from taxes that are levied on improved economic growth, right? So if a particular region enjoys something of an economic boom in consequence of the putting in place of new infrastructures or upgraded infrastructures, the tax take can increase without having to change the rate or the formula or anything of that kind. And so in effect, what you're doing then is you're sort of treating economic growth as something in which the bank has a kind of equity stake rather than a debt stake. And that's not too difficult, of course, to do in real terms, even while superficially on the surface looking as though you're engaged in a kind of banking operation rather than a direct financing operation. So in that sense, I mean, I feel a little ambivalent about saying this because I'm kind of pushing a kind of dishonesty or a kind of trick. But I'm not above doing that if that's what it takes in order actually to get the public to start doing public things again. And perhaps once we're doing that, it'll be even easier then to make the case for not relying on a banking model at all, but just instead returning to the model of just direct public expenditure on obvious and manifest public goods.
You've made a very important point. That's wonderful. You could think of the Second Avenue subway in New York City. It cost like maybe $2 billion, and it raised real estate prices by $5 billion. If you could have had a tax recovery for the windfall gains, then you could do it. You could do the Chicago pipeline water supply, because that's going to increase prices all along. But then you're going to be, this is the most hard to do political thing there is. And I think you would almost have to make a condition of the bank loan to be the rent recapture. Otherwise, you will be using this to create a bonanza of rent for people that you're not interested in, who are not your constituency. This is absolutely critical, the point you've just made.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff. Ellen, you've had your hand up.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Well, that's great and all very interesting. I just wanted to throw in one more example of a foreign bank. The Japan Post Bank was called the Japan's second budget because the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was not even a depository bank, but Japan Post Bank was the largest depository bank in the world until Fukushima, and then it got largely privatized because the government needed the money, so they sold it off. But anyway, the point is, at one point, it was the largest depository bank in the world. It took Japan, the people of Japan put their money in Japan Post Bank, which then could be used for very cheap liquidity for loans. So that is one problem we have with all of our public banks, is where are we going to get cheap liquidity? If we have to pay the Fed funds rate at whatever they're jacking it up to, if that's going to be one of our costs, we're not going to be able to make very low interest loans. But if we could borrow, if we can get it from deposits, if we had all the deposits, or, if people believed in this theory or this model and put their money in this bank, we could borrow for free, and then we could leverage it, for real cheap and and that was off budget financing. The Japan Post Bank was considered off budget, the second budget, off budget financing for the Japanese government, which is what Reconstruction Finance Corporation, why it was so great, was that it was off budget financing, which is obviously what we need because Congress doesn't want to cough up any more budget money for this project. That's my thought.
Isn't that what Eric Hardmeyer said that they're doing at the Bank of North Dakota? Is they're putting some things off budget? I know we had to talk about this before.
Yes, he does. He and I sort of check in fairly regularly, and it's quite remarkable. I mean, in a way, to some extent, I think this improves the case that we have just been making for public acceptability of essentially a public institution. I mean, as you guys know, North Dakota is a red state. They vote for Republicans. But one thing that they won't ever let you, one form of quote unquote socialism that they won't ever let you touch or take away is their Bank of North Dakota, right? They'll say, keep your government hands off my Bank of North Dakota. And so it works. I mean, all we really need to do, it seems to me, is kind of find a way to get the institution up and running so that people can then experience it. And at that point, all those sort of labels begin to fall away, and people begin actually to accept and even to embrace and love the institution as a great sort of public treasure in effect. And Eric, for what it's worth, I mean, is not, he's a very mainstream North Dakotan fellow, but he just understands as a matter of common sense what the institution does, and many North Dakotans, including private sector business people, understand what it does and seem to love it. And as you guys probably know, back in 2020, there were some really interesting Washington Post and even Wall Street Journal stories about how the Bank of North Dakota turned out to be the most efficient disseminator of federal funds to sort of assist with weathering the storm of the early months of the pandemic.
Bob, I see in the chat that you've got to run off to a class as well. We have all these professors on board, but in the chat, there are a number of interesting points that are made. You can save the chat by clicking on the Save the Chat menu in that. So thank you. And Bob, thank you very much for your participation here. I think we've only got a few minutes left, but I do want to bring it home a little bit. I'm going to call on, out of the blue, I'm going to call on Mark Armstrong, who has made a very useful comment there, but also who I think has been giving some thought to how the NIB might be applied and relate to the grassroots work that we're doing from the Public Banking Institute and other groupings around the country. And perhaps, Mark, you can give us some insight or some thoughts about some strategic ways forward that we can all support this, that we can support this effort.
Sure. Let me just comment on what's in it for a state or regional public bank to partner with the NIB. There is, of course, the importance of, when you have a very large infrastructure loan, that is problematic for a bank because they have to allocate capital for that. And so what the NIB would be providing is they would be holding that on their balance sheet. And
Right.
so the regional public bank or the state public bank would provide all sorts of different services with a team of folks, compliance officers, loan officers, folks who would be responsible for making that loan successful, you know, whether it's a waterworks project or whatever it may be. And so there'd be fees being paid by the, I think it would be from the NIB to the public bank. And in addition to that, the public bank can also create revolving loan funds. Now, I know revolving loan funds are a dirty word in the public banking world, but it is true that in Germany, the Sparkassen Bank has funded the majority of the solar installations on residential and commercial properties using revolving loan funds. So it's too expensive to use from a compliance point of view to use credit. It's better to just to create an investment fund for people who want to invest locally. Let's say they want to invest in a green project, and then that money is managed by the regional bank and would supplement the funds that would be provided by the NIB. So there's a lot of different opportunities for a public bank to work in partnership with the NIB.
Yeah, great. And so part of the engineering, the design of this law, and it might be that we want to suggest to the NIB folks that there are some specific accommodations for this sort of interfacing with local public banks, and also I think toward sources of liquidity. I mean, I think Ellen's point about liquidity is a big one, and especially if the Fed funds rate are not, you know, are not conducive, and if we don't have standing with the Fed, the Public Banking Act made a foray into that realm, and it might be that too gets onto our agenda for grassroots support for public banking. Anyone else? Go ahead, Ellen.
No, I just couldn't hear you, but you went out, but you came back.
Okay. All right. Any more comments at the moment, or any questions for Alfecca on this? How do we collaborate in a way? First of all, anybody object to the collaboration aside from Michael's good and reasonable understanding of how the money system works and how we don't want it to work? It seems to me that we are in this evolutionary moment, uniquely positioned as organizations, but also because we have now some national traction with a bill before the legislature, which is growing. They've got almost 20 sponsors. One of the things they want to do is build Senate sponsorship. And I think one of the things that this group might be uniquely positioned to help with is to find sponsors that are at the Senate level and at the House level to be able to invigorate a campaign around this. I think if the people in our circles understand that infrastructure finance is central to the building and investment in our neighborhoods and our cities and in our own well-being, if we accept that this is part of the work, then we can adopt it, take it under our wing, and do what we can to enable it. You know, go ahead, Ellen. You've got, please.
All right, well, that's fine. Sorry. But I just, because we only have a few minutes left, I'd love to hear comments from Tim and Bob Hasegawa and Gar and Melissa, who haven't spoken, and they've taken the time to show up. So I'd love to hear what they have to say.
Okay. All right. Melissa, any comments that you'd like to offer? Being a community banker?
Yes. Well, I mean, I actually find it exciting. I think it's would be a good it seems like an extremely natural connection for public banks and public banking to support the establishment of an NIB. I think it makes a lot of sense because I can see it as part of the landscape of banking and an important complement and necessary. like needed.
Mhm.
So that's, to me, the reason to do it. I think it makes sense to pursue, from my perspective, the community development, financial institutions and that infrastructure that exists in the US to, to be in support of it as well. Because the CDFI infrastructure, people will tend to go, well, why can't the CDFIs take it? But a big part of it is scale. It's all about scale. And so but to have the CDFIs who have good relationships throughout Congress, that's the reason for it.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Good points, Melissa. And I think that whole opportunity to bring community bankers and credit unions and CDFIs together around this is something that we can work on together. And I know that the NIB Coalition would be more than happy to be able to present half an hour, 45-minute introductions and briefings of local representatives. So let's, and anybody else that you think needs to hear it. I think that people need to hear that their voice will matter about building an infrastructure finance capability as we move forward. Bob or Gar, any comments from you guys?
Or Tim.
Or Tim, absolutely.
Well, let me first congratulate everyone, particularly Walt and Ellen. And sitting here thinking about the development of this organization and of public banking, I put on my, sometimes historian's hat, and I'm really quite. I think people need to think about how impressive the developmental work has been so far. There's a wonderful comment. I'm blocking the name of the historian. It's about how things change. I think all the work that has been done is, in a sense, preliminary, and I'm very optimistic that has been laid by the hard work of this organization. There will be a moment when some of this will explode into real change. So just that sense of perspective and also appreciation for the work that's been done, and particularly by the leadership and Walt and Ellen. Those are my thoughts as I tune in today. So thank you.
Thank you, Gar. Always.
Thanks, Gar. And Nicole and Suzanne and Kimberly have also done great work since they're here.
I absolutely wanted to shout out to our staff, Kimbria and Suzanne, who are long suffering, very active, and very important for keeping PBI visible and connectable and on track. So thank you both. Bob or Tim, any comments from you, Tim? The land of devastated Florida.
Again, my corner of Florida doesn't seem devastated at all. It's quite beautiful here right now. But as we know, the West Coast, the Gulf Coast has been hit hard. I am glad to see this connection really being made between the National Development Bank and state public banking. I've been supportive of both for a long time, and to see this effort to kind of bring them together is, I think, an important one. And I appreciate that. I appreciate all the work that many of you have been doing to grow this institute. And I haven't been as engaged for the past some period of time, and I'm glad to be starting to get back into it. I've been mostly focusing my own research on the Federal Reserve and these proposals, or maybe it's beyond proposals now, for central bank digital currencies. But I want to be much more engaged in the future. And again, I'm giving some more thinking, and this meeting has given a lot of food for thought about how to bring these two agendas together, really, for National Development Bank financing and the local community banks and public banking.
So thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. Great to hear
Thanks,
from you.
Tim. And we should connect you with Rowan Gray, who has a measure for e-cash, which is
better than CBDCs. Yeah.
Where is Rohan now?
Rowan is at Willamette University in Oregon. and be happy to connect you two. Absolutely.
I would love to be back in touch with them. Thank you, Walt.
Yeah, great, very good. All right, and Bob, it's so good to see you. The indomitable, indefatigable Bob Hasagawa.
First public banking. Still, yep.
No, I'm just kicking back to hear the very interesting conversations here. Yeah, for me, when I first heard about the NIB effort, it seemed like a no-brainer. I mean, it fits hand in glove, understanding that we're in a period where we're so far away from socialized monetary policy, I guess, and we're still stuck with a banking model. But hearing Thomas speak, I think, at first about considering governance structure modifications possibly to the approach, but we're pre-describing where the money is to be spent, which sort of precludes public input and buy-in into the system. So maybe there needs to be some sort of accommodation where market failures can be identified that the National Infrastructure Bank can then fill in, like with the huge unbanked population, or wherever money. We're so far away from that though. Right now, we can't even make sure that all utilities are under social control as opposed to private control. So I think an intermediate step makes a ton of sense, and this is the best way to move forward with it, I think.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, thanks.
Well, we have run out of our time. This has been a really wonderful opening to a conversation that we'd like to continue in very practical sort of ways. And I think that this group, as you can see, is quite a special selection of forces, of minds, and of connections that is important for us to pull together. The Public Banking Institute, that's kind of how we work. We draw on people's commitments and interests and visions and pull ourselves into some sort of a doable agenda. I think that's something that we'd like you to stay tuned with on this particular subject. And certainly let's stay in touch and have this conversation grow as we move our game forward. Alfeka, thank you so much for your presentation and for your work. I think everybody can feel at home to be in touch with Alfeka and with the coalition, and you'll probably be on their list now. So let's keep this energy, this synergy. Let's start to really build this thing in very real ways for us to take next steps that will matter, because there's no time to waste, as you know. Thank you very much once again to one and all.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.